So we're ready to get going. All righty. Thank you all for joining us on this beautiful, sunny spring day for a very timely and important conversation. Defunding the police, why now, with John Simon. We'll talk a little bit more about John and this event, but it seems very, very important for us all. My name is Andy Gaines, and as many of you know, I'm the executive director of Ashby Village. Ashby Village is a community-based nonprofit organization that's hosting this event. Ashby Village connects us with one another, offering support and opportunities for meaningful engagement that enable us to age with a sense of belonging and dignity. Together, we're transforming the way we age in the East Bay communities. During this pandemic, Ashby Village has actively continued to provide its programming, and this is one of them, really dynamic, vital programs. And we continue to support members in their homes. With the vaccine recently and the easing of restrictions, we've begun offering an increasing number of services to our members. And we'd love for you, if you're interested, to find out more about becoming a member, a volunteer, a donor, or an Ashby Village enthusiast, of which there are many. Invite you to please join us. We have a virtual living room chat we've set up for Tuesday, May 25th from 2 to 3 p.m. And you can see it in the chat box. Check out our website or call the office if you'd like to find out more. So as you know, today's event is free for everyone to attend, but Ashby Village relies on donations from people like you in order to bring programs such as this to our members and friends. And I want to bring, once again, your attention to the chat box where we placed a link for a simple way for you to make a donation at your leisure. We thank you for your support. So as we get going on the program, 3 of our leaders who participate in arts and culture and elder action will be carrying the presentation forward. Roberta Pressman will be introducing John. Julie Freestone will be moderating your questions, and Irene Marcos will be doing a fond farewell. So with that, thanks again for joining us. Thank you for being part of our village, and I want to pass it over to Roberta.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome on behalf of Ashby Village's Elder Action. It is with great pleasure that I'll be introducing our speaker today to help enlighten us about the issues and challenges surrounding police reform, a major area of political action for our Elder Action group. If you'd like to learn more about Elder Action and our activities, please add your name and email address to our chat box, and we'll be in touch with you. The disproportionate killing of people of color at the hands of the police has once again highlighted, as in other pivotal moments in America's history, the problem of racism in America. This time, the spotlight is focused squarely on racist actions on the part of the police in many communities across the country. Perhaps more than ever, we as a nation, because of social media and the 24-hour news cycle, have had the horrifying and chilling effects of questionable and arguably racist police practices brought front and center into our living rooms. And just when we thought there could be no more images more excruciating than those seen in the past few weeks, both within the Chauvin trial and simultaneously within the larger Minneapolis community, we had to watch the killing of a 13-year-old boy at the hands of the Chicago police. The cries for police reform echoing across America as a result of these events have not only focused on eliminating racist practices within policing, they've also prompted an entire rethinking of the role of the police in our society. Defunding the police has become a rallying cry as a solution to the ills of police practices. But we know that these issues are far more complex than just a matter of funding. And we know that not all policing is negative. This requires nuanced solutions and understanding of the appropriate role of the police in our society. Shall we reform, defund, abolish? We're fortunate to have Jonathan Simon, Professor of Criminal Justice at the UC Berkeley School of Law, join us today to help us navigate these thorny issues. Professor Simon has an undergraduate degree, a law degree, and a PhD from UC Berkeley. He's been on the faculty of the Berkeley Law School since 2003, where he's currently the Lance Robbins Professor of Criminal Justice Law. His scholarship concerns the role of crime and criminal justice in governing contemporary societies, and also the history of the interdisciplinary study of law. His published works include 70 articles and a number of monographs, among them, Poor Discipline, Parole and the Social Control of the Underclass, a winner of the American Sociological Association Sociology of Law Book Prize, and Governing Through Crime, How the War on Crime Transformed American Democracy and Created a Culture of Fear, winner of the American Society of Criminology Award. His scholarship has been recognized internationally with appointments to the University of Edinburgh, to the Israeli Institute for Advanced Studies, and as a fellow of the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Professor Simon, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me today, and I'm deeply honored to be before so many of you. This is a humbling moment to join in a conversation of this sort. And although it's a beautiful day here in Berkeley, and many of you hopefully are having the benefit of vaccination and getting out, I don't think I need to do much to remind you that we are in a moment of deep crisis. We are living with a pandemic that has now killed 500,000 Americans before their time, and 3 million people worldwide. We've experienced, following the murder of George Floyd last May, the greatest wave of social protests in this country since the late 1960s and early 1970s, a period I suspect many people on this call recall or remember well. Within this crisis, our system of punishment has loomed large as deeply flawed. Our prisons, which are fortunately beginning to drop in numbers, but have proven to be a terrible vector for the pandemic, leading to many unnecessary deaths behind bars, something that is a huge disgrace to a society, to put people behind bars and then allow them to die from a preventable disease. We've been through an election unlike any that probably any of us can remember. You have to go back to something like the 1880s for a similar level of anxiety and national dissolution. Police have been repeatedly in front of us. The New York Times noted in today's edition that just since the George Floyd trial has begun, some 64 Americans have been killed by the police. Now, obviously not all of them are necessarily killed in unjustifiable circumstances, but it contextualizes some of the level of violence that we've experienced. We have been finally coming to reckon with some of our deepest problems of racism, problems of exclusion, problems that integrate with those, but also take the form of houselessness, homelessness, and ill shelter of all sorts. At the same time, we're also experiencing a very frightening surge in homicides, the biggest surge in something like 30 years, including an alarming number of mass killings, and I don't have to remind you of any of those. Now, I say all this because moments like this leave a deep mark on a society and also invite us to reflect deeply on our values, on our institutions, and what we want. There's a reason I think that the big leaps forward in some ways in human rights in American history have usually followed terrible wars. There's something about the weight of the dead on the living that gives us courage to demand or ask questions about the basic premises of our social compact. I want to remind you again, since I suspect many on this call have some historical picture, that we've been here before. The last time the nation was having a protracted discussion about racial justice, about policing, about nonviolence. The picture behind me was taken in my hometown of Chicago in the year 1968, when many people felt that questions of racial justice and reinventing policing were finally going to be on the agenda. But this night in August of 1968 was followed very quickly by other directions. 4 months later, Richard Nixon was elected president on a hard law and order campaign that, if you count the Wallace vote, was a pretty majority opinion and among the electorate. A year later, the Chicago police murdered Fred Hampton. Maybe some of you have seen the movie Judas and the Black Messiah, which tells the story of Hampton's amazing multiracial organizing in Chicago. When he was murdered a year later after this event, it again marked the beginning of the end of that moment of possible change. So we're back at a moment like that. And I recount all of this to suggest that if we're ever at a moment to rethink and reimagine what we want in the form of security and justice in America, I think it's now. Now, as I offer some of my own views, and I want to highlight, first of all, I'm going to share some history that I don't think is my own view. I think we have a shared history, and while it can be interpreted in different ways, it's important that we share a common history to make progress going forward. But when it comes to values, when it comes to perspective, people have very different views, and I consider myself a student of the history of these institutions, but my views on them are also shaped by my moral views and my perspective. So I don't want you to, I'm not throwing my PhD up here as a way to silence you. In fact, I hope to encourage your thoughts. And let me ask a couple of questions of you while you're sort of that maybe can ruminate in the background as I offer some of my reflections on the current moment and how we got here. So the first question is, when and where have you felt safe and secure? When and where have you felt safe and secure? And sort of follow-up question, what role do other people play in your sense of safety and security? And what role do the police play in your sense of safety and security? Second question, can you recall a time when a figure of authority mistreated you, humiliated you, disrespected your dignity in a fundamental way? How did that make you feel? How did that change your relationship to those institutions that gave that figure the authority, whether it was a teacher, a police officer, God forbid, a professor, or a boss? So I'm going to let those ruminate, because I want to come back to this when we think about together about how we'd like to see public safety evolve over the next, say, 50 years. Now, I just want to remind you that the institutions that we have, prisons, police, are old. They're very old in many respects. Our prisons, the basic concept, was shaped over 250 years ago, based largely on the model of enslavement, which was a global phenomena at the time, and to some extent anchored in scientific views of disease that no longer exist. That is, John Howard and other early proponents of the prison believed that crime was a disease, and like other diseases, it spread by decomposing organic matter. It was known as the miasma theory of medicine. It was a predominant theory until the middle of the 19th century, more or less. The prison, it was intended to free people of that disease by putting them in well-ventilated sort of cages, usually located near lakes, rivers, or bodies of water to bring in fresh air and water. As you can see, this is a model of crime causation that has few academic or practical supporters today. Our police concept, and I will be mostly talking about police today, but I hope we can come back a little bit toward the end to talk about prisons because they're less visible, unless you're driving to Marin here in the Bay Area, but by and large, they're less visible, but they're very, very important in terms of the damage they do. Our police concept in its dominant form goes back at least 200 years to the colonialist police force set up in Dublin, Ireland by the British to control Dublin, and eventually brought to London and later the eastern seaboard of the United States, largely in response to Irish immigration in the mid-19th century. Our other systems, including probation, parole, and juvenile justice, were invented about a century ago, part of the great wave of criminal justice reform in response to another high wave of immigration, and also the high tide of something I'll come back to, the eugenics movement, a form of scientific racism that promised that a great deal could be done by differentiating citizens based on their racial and other background rather than on, say, their law-abiding behavior or lack thereof. So we've got very, very old institutions. Most of them anchored in either scientific ideas or moral contexts that are now very much out of date. Now, I want to go into more detail on that history, but I also want to start up front by sort of telling you what I think, or where my conclusions have gathered. And I want to begin with my values, the values that I bring to this, because I think we can't pretend that everything is a question of empirical evidence or even historical interpretation. Values are very, very important, and it's times like these that force us to ask what our values are. So I think there are two values that should really reshape, participate in our reimagining and reshaping of public safety today. And they're values that I don't think I'm idiosyncratic in holding out. I think they're values that have gathered strength, over the half century since the scene behind me unfolded in Chicago. And these aren't in order, they're both of equal magnitude, but I can't say them both at once. So one value goes today by the slogan, Black Lives Matter. And it's really our value of equal human dignity and the idea that our public institutions must respect that equal human dignity with everything they do. It's not acceptable to have some part of our community in a permanent form of second-class citizenship where their lives are simply not valued. And we unfortunately repeatedly seen that that's true with our Black citizens. It's also true, although it's less visible, with our Indigenous Native Americans. And I think it's helpful to keep in mind that Black people in America, Native Americans, have long been defined as sort of the ultimate threat against which some notion of public safety has been framed for us. To give you a flavor of how this looks even today, my friend Jeff Ward, a sociologist at Washington University in St. Louis, reports that if you go to the headquarters of the St. Louis Police, one of the most notoriously racially problematic police forces among many in the country, right in front of the headquarters in a little park, there is a monument that celebrates, and I don't know how many 100 years, but the beginning of, quote, white settlement in St. Louis, right? So when you walk up to the headquarters of policing in St. Louis, you are invited to embrace and celebrate, centuries of white settlement and whatever's been necessary to keep that safe, which has basically meant exterminating Indigenous people and keeping Black people under very tight control. We often hear that white supremacy is the real problem and that we need to remove it. And I think that's right. I think it's helpful to keep in mind that today, public safety or public safety related institutions may be our most important form of white supremacy. And so our discussion about policing is quite relevant to that larger goal. If you think about the history of white supremacy, and I'll be talking about some other features of it, it includes different ideas and different sort of frameworks. One is the notion of the white race as a superior race, something that was given a big rejuvenation a century ago in the eugenics movement and is obviously not dead today, as we saw in Charlotte, North Carolina a couple of years ago and have repeatedly seen, including in the Capitol in January. There's also the history of what you could call a white spoil system. Lots of jobs in government were reserved for white citizens until the 1950s, and that excluded Asians, it excluded many people, and especially Black people. And finally, and that white spoil system is not totally gone. It has ways of recreating itself, but its legal basis is now largely erased. The one that has, I think, been hardest to remove is this, what you might call white space, the idea that we are safe only when we're in spaces that are dominated by white institutions. White institutions are institutions that place the security of white people sort of at their center, and that can be true even if they're made up of people who don't happen to be white, like the White House is a white institution even when a Black person happens to be living in it. And police departments, I think, are largely white institutions, even though some of them in America today are majority Black and are very diverse in many ways. So I think we have to overcome white supremacy and make Black Lives Matter, no matter what else we do with this moment of change. The other value, which I think is in some ways integral to the first one, they're related to each other, is really anti-violence, a commitment to dealing with America's very long legacy of violence. And although we've enjoyed some drop in violent crime over the last couple of decades, it has remained all too high in many parts of America. And it's important to keep in mind here that many of the people who are calling for abolition and defunding are doing so in large part because they're coming from communities that suffer from very high levels of interpersonal violence as well as police violence. And they want an end to that, something that they don't think they're getting by and large from our current institutions. So now too often, here I'm going to give my probably one piece of good news or upbeat perspective in this talk about very serious and problematic features of our history and our society. But the good news is this: too often these two values, making Black Lives Matter and sort of ending violence in America, are treated as if they're at some kind of tension with each other, some kind of trade-off with each other. That if we're going to make Black Lives Matter by, say, reducing or changing what the police do, that is going to open the door for violent crime. And I don't think that's true. I think a good look at both of these values and the institutions we're talking about suggests that we can make Black Lives Matter and we can actually do a better job addressing violence than we have in American society up till now. Now, having shared some good news, let me say two pretty harsh truths in my view, but again, they're my view. And I say this with great deal of respect for, because these are both harsh truths about policing. I say it with a great deal of respect toward people in policing. I think it's fair to say, as a student of the modern police as well as the history, that today's police personnel are the best police we've ever had. They're the most educated, the best trained, they're the most diverse in a wide variety of ways. In terms of attitudes, they're far less racist than the people behind me. I mean, sociologists studied policing in the late 60s. And when they went around and did surveys of people like the Chicago police and just asked them about, attitudes that are classically aligned with anti-Black animus, and 80 to 90%, openly admitted to those views. If you did similar surveys today, I think you'd find that modern police forces are generally in line with the racial diversity, not 100%, but the anti-racist values of a great deal of our citizenry. So I don't say either of these things with a view that police as actors are bad people or that they can't be an important part of creating both a world where Black Lives Matter and where violence is no longer tolerated to the extent that we have. So here's the first harsh thing. There is nothing that can be done to make policing less anti-Black than it is right now that doesn't involve shrinking the power of the police to govern and control the lives of Black people. Let me repeat that briefly because I want to be understood. There's nothing that can be done to make policing less anti-Black than it is right now that doesn't amount to some form of shrinking the power of the police to control the lives of Black people. And that by and large means the power of the police to confront Black people who don't want to be confronted by them, people like George Floyd, people like Dante Wright. And we can talk about some of the ways to achieve that. Now, there's a great deal that can be done to improve policing in terms of race. And one of the most important would be real steps to acknowledge the damage done by police institutions in every American city to the Black communities in those communities. And some police chiefs, to their credit, have done exactly that. But things have to begin with actually acknowledging harm if you really want to restore and repair. So I think a lot can be done, and that's a good in itself. It will improve those communities directly. But I don't think without real changes in policing, even that kind of acknowledgement will change the anti-Black nature of policing, because that's built much more into the mission we've given them than it is to the attitudes that they have. So here's the second harsh truth. Police have at best a modest and inconsistent effect on violent crime. Let me repeat that too. Police have at best a modest and irregular effect on violent crime. Now, what I don't mean by that is if we suddenly got rid of the police tomorrow or if they went on strike, we wouldn't see an upsurge in crime of all sort, including violent crime. We've had a few occasions like that in history. The Nazis, for instance, arrested the Oslo police department just ahead of a feared Allied invasion. And the crime did go up by all accounts, even in a city under siege and with the solidarity of wartime. But what's clear is that if you think about violent crime, and unfortunately, I'm going to ask you to think about homicide, and it happens all too often in our society, police really have very few levers to stop it, right? So how does somebody my age get murdered? It's usually in a confrontation with a spouse, an adult child who may be suffering from severe mental illness, a business partner. Police can't stop those crimes. They may, depending on when they're called in, they may be able to intervene in a domestic violence situation. That's one of the most dangerous situations they face. One of the times they're most likely to be shot is when they're trying to prevent usually a male partner from using violence, armed violence against a spouse. If you're young and poor, how are you most likely to be killed? Well, by bumping into another member of your kind of rival peer set at a moment when you're not expecting to see them, and when both of you make bad decisions. Again, there's not a lot the police can do to stop that, right? They can try to take guns off the street, but we know that we have a very porous society when it comes to guns. Now, there are times that it seems to me the police can actually stop homicides. Actually, these mass killings we've seen are one good example. Often people sort of who choose to do a terroristic act like that anticipate either being killed or captured, and basically they usually end pretty quickly after the police confront them. But again, those are actually, even though we hear about them all the time, those are far from the common form of homicide that we deal with. One way to keep this in mind is this: police only clear, that is, find somebody they think is responsible for, about half of all homicides in America. They only clear about half of all homicides. In Black communities and communities of color, that gets way lower, 30, 40, 20% in some cities, some areas. That means a number of things. It means we already live with lots of people, unfortunately, who have committed homicide and never been held accountable for it. That has consequences, I don't doubt. But again, we already live in a society that doesn't stop or address, and that's the violent crime we know about. A lot of it is never reported. If we think about things like rape, it goes off the charts in terms of unreported, unresolved acts of violence. And again, the police don't seem to be able to do much about, and certainly haven't been able to up till now. So before I go further, I just want to hit I want to take a brief digression for some definitions, right? Definitions are a good thing, so bear with me. So what do I mean by police? Well, actually there are two, I want to give you two words I want there to be a word police, and then a word the police, or if you want to call them the cops, that's okay too. That came from the copper badges that the New York Metropolitan Police wore in the 19th century, so there's nothing really pejorative about it, copper. But police is a much older concept. It goes back to ancient Greece. It pretty much comes from the same root as polity or polis, and it's the basic idea that the community should, in an organized way, take steps to maintain its health, its safety, its security and dignity through all kinds of things, whether it's schools and hospitals, public health, cleaning the city, traffic control, and of course, crime is part of that, but it's only a very small part of it, or only one part of it. The police, the cops, that is an organized way to sort of, for cities to achieve some of the goals of police. But as we'll see, it was developed for very specific reasons at a very specific time, and isn't really designed to be an all-purpose police in the first sense of the term. Defunding the police, what does defunding mean? I think for most people who use that phrase, defunding the police means taking at least some of the funds that we currently spend on policing and reinvesting that in other either public agencies or community organizations that will address the very same problems that we are currently asking the police to solve. Abolition, abolishing the police. This is a little trickier, right? And defunding, I think quite intentionally, doesn't necessarily take a stand on that. Let me say that I think the question of abolition is always a very important one. And when we hear calls to abolish ICE or abolish the police, they deserve our greatest attention, because what they're really saying is there's something about this institution that doesn't work well with human dignity. Now, does that mean that it can't be changed, or reformed? That's often an open question that can take generations to solve, right? Could slavery be made compatible with human dignity? Some people thought so in the early 19th century. I think today, people around the world agree it cannot be. Is capitalism compatible with human dignity? Many of my students don't think so. But again, I ask them, well, what kind of capitalism do you have in mind? The current kind of capitalism we have does seem to be stretching the bounds of human dignity for many people in the gig economy and elsewhere. But we've seen times and places where regulation, labor law, welfare, and things like this have made it something other than a loss of human dignity to essentially enter a labor contract. What do I mean by anti-Black? This is kind of my last term. To me, anti-Black is a description of institutions more than anything else. And it characterizes institutions that make Blackness a basis for suspicion, surveillance, or any kind of negative sorting or attention. So take a deep breath. I'll take a sip of ginger ale. I want to go through a really rapid tour of history here. And my point is pretty much this. We didn't invent the police to stop violence, let alone to protect Black lives. We invented them for very different reasons. And while we've kind of put more jobs on them over the years and invested a lot in trying to change them, it's sometimes very hard to move an institution from what its basic design was based on. So let's go back to the colonial era, before the revolution. The kind of criminal legal system, if you want to call it that, or criminal justice system that you would have found consisted basically of the only things that would be similar to what we have today would be courts and prosecutors. You had criminal courts in local jurisdictions all over the colonies. You had public prosecutors, which is actually an innovation, something that England wouldn't have until the 20th century. Where slavery held, you had what some would argue is the root of the police. I would argue is one root of the modern police, and that's the slave patrol. Slave patrol, though, is something more similar to an institution that existed all over the colonies, and that's the night watch. That is essentially a drafted group of citizens required to patrol the city, looking for dangers and fire and danger, basically, and warning, alerting people if they found that. Wherever slavery held sway, that became a much more intense focus on Black bodies. The entire white population was generally co-opted into or invited into exercising that authority. And I think it's important to be accurate and complex. Modern police forces may well have absorbed personnel and certainly ideas from those early slave patrols, but the kind of bureaucratic, quasi-professional or professionalizable police that we have today are really a product later of the 19th century. There were some of the biggest slave cities like Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans did have essentially organized bureaucratic slave patrols, largely private, that is run by or owned, controlled by the marketeers themselves. So that's the world that we kind of come into. And one of the amazing things, and let's focus on, say, Boston or Philadelphia right now, where we kind of imagine the cradle of liberty to be. These are cities without police, even as they reach hundreds of thousands of people. Boston has got a couple of 100,000 people in 1830. Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia is a little bigger than that. None of them have police departments. None of them have prisons. They have, until the 1820s and 30s, they at best have jails, which are local institutions, but not the kind of spaces of large penitentiary style incarceration we would later have. So a great deal of what we now think of as unimaginable to live without, that is uniformed, organized 24/7 police forces and prisons in every state and many in most states, didn't exist for the first 50 years, more or less, of our history. Prisons began to be developed in the 1820s and pretty much had spread across the country by the 1880s. Some of you know that our own sort of turn into that kind of incarceration began with San Quentin prison in the 1850s. So we were right in that, even though we were at the periphery of civilization at that point. But, and this is a theme that we'll come back to, the building of prisons and the creation of police forces was largely a response to immigration, fear of immigrants, fear of immigration and the disorder that it would bring. San Francisco, although at the outer bounds of civilization in 1848, was also the hub of the gold rush, which made it the fastest growing city on the planet for a while and the most diverse. And if you want a one-sentence explanation for San Quentin, it was that diversity basically led the city fathers to see the need for a prison, as they did in Philadelphia a few decades earlier. Policing comes a little bit later in those same cities, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore in the 1840s, and it spreads to every big city in the country pretty much as it becomes big by the 1880s. And again, the overwhelming reason is immigration. And originally it's the Irish. Boston in 1830 has, as I said, about 200,000 people. Over the next 15 years or so during the potato famine, you'll have 20 or 30,000 Irish people a year moving to Boston, which rivals anything that when we talk about sort of a crisis on the border today, et cetera, in terms of per capita. And it was met, as you might not be surprised to learn, with utter revulsion by the nativist white settlers who considered the Irish not white and not Christian and certainly not fit to live with in the same city, and immediately wanted a strong police force to keep them under control. Although part of the job of the police was also to prevent those white nativists from rioting and setting fire to Irish neighborhoods. Now, as you all know, in the great saga of American immigration, the Irish would soon become the police, and would be future waves of immigrants that the police would be policing. But the basic task was overwhelmingly aimed at really three things: preventing riots. And again, riots were a huge threat to essentially the burgeoning commercial economy. Cities like Boston and New York already had what we think of today as downtowns, with expensive buildings filled with expensive merchandise and expensive artifacts that could easily be destroyed by mobs. And so the idea of being able to prevent that with a quasi-military force was enormously appealing to the dominant interests in those cities. And keep in mind, policing was not welcomed by ordinary Americans by and large. They knew it was aimed at them. It was incredibly expensive because you had to hire people and pay them, season in and season out. And so it was not popular. It was supported by and large by the elite interests in the city who cared about preventing rioting, preventing theft, which again was a huge problem for early commercial capitalism. People coming into stores, essentially shoplifting, larceny, which remains a problem to the extent that we still have stores, was a real threat in a sense to commercial interests in those cities, and they wanted police to do something about that. And they viewed this kind of immigrant workforce as a proto-revolutionary or proto-insurrectionist force that they wanted to be surveilled, they wanted to be monitored, they wanted to be moved along when they began to gather too many at the wrong place. And these are the functions that we, in a sense, still associate with policing, some 100 years later. In many ways, the war on drugs would just be a continuation of that. And indeed, until the 1950s, you know what the most common crime that people were arrested for in America? Vagrancy, which basically meant sitting around in the city without having any obvious means of support. So there is an irony. I'm going to get to the end of this part of the story here. There's an irony here. Prisons and police were not actually originally focused on Black communities. Not to say that when Black people weren't present, they didn't end up in those prisons, and they did in Philadelphia and indeed in San Quentin, although there were very few Black people yet in California. But the reason is that Black communities were overwhelmingly rural in the 19th century. Something like 95% of all Black people in 1900 lived in rural villages in the Deep South. It was only what we today call the Great Migration that brought hundreds of thousands of Black people out of those rural villages and into cities all across the Eastern Seaboard, the Midwest, eventually in the Second World War, the West Coast of the United States. It's only then that, in a sense, the focus of policing became Black. And that's what I'm going to turn to now, how criminal justice became Black and white. And there's a great book I recommend. I'll mention a few books here. If you have other questions for further reading, I'll be happy to address emails, or I can send a list to the Ashby Village folks. But the great historian Khalil Muhammad, currently at Harvard, his book, The Condemnation of Blackness, sort of tells this story, and eugenics is very much at the center of it. So let me give you a quick history lesson in eugenics. And again, it may be the most important thing I'll talk about today, because in many ways it's still with us. We're talking about a movement that swept the world, but no more intensely than the United States in the roughly the 1890s through the 1930s. And it was essentially a new understanding of both racism and imperialism that claimed to place the dominance of white and Northern European whites in particular over their domestic populations and over the world based on their superior biology. And this was anchored in, it was supposed, both biological and anthropological science, although very little biology and very self-serving anthropology, as you can imagine. The premise here was incredibly exciting to a lot of people. Most social problems, like crime, mental illness, unemployment, could simply be bred out of society. How? First, by restricting immigration from places of inferior races. That meant in that period, Asia, and also Eastern and Southern Europe. The segregation of all domestic inferior races, that meant particularly Black people, Asian people, Indigenous people, if they remained anywhere near white people, and increasingly Latinx populations, although it would be a long time until they were more visible to the whole country. Sterilization. Over close to 100,000 American women were sterilized legally by their states, a movement that lasted into the 1950s, and some people claim continues today in prisons and other settings, but it was above board, and it was proudly offered as the best kind of scientific solution. In fact, you probably know that the great progressive jurisprudential hero, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., wrote the obscene opinion in Buck versus Bell, where in 9 paragraphs, he upheld the sterilization of a woman that he called, he famously said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, and pointed out that it was a waste of money to wait to execute the offspring when you could simply prevent the birth of the unfit to begin with. And it's an interesting thing about eugenics that it was promoted not by what you might imagine to be reactionary forces, but by the progressives of that era. It was university professors like me that would have been Berkeley, Stanford, Harvard, that were big champions of eugenics. And we still have big libraries full of eugenics books from that era that I could show you. So most amazingly of all, I think, these kind of outrageous and revolutionary legal goals were largely accomplished. In 1924, immigration from almost all of Asia and from Eastern and Southern Europe was cut off, and an overtly racist and explicitly based on eugenics population cap was placed on every nationality, tied to the percentage they had in the census in 1865, right? So before the tide of immigration in the late 19th century. The prohibition. A lot of people don't know that it was mostly promoted as a eugenic method. It was thought that alcohol and pubs were sites of miscegenation, and also that they deteriorated or helped to degenerate white people as well. And that, of course, took a constitutional amendment, but that was no problem. So it's really it's by the middle of the 20s when essentially immigration from Europe and Asia goes from a gusher to a trickle. And the Black migration from the South, the Great Migration, begins to pick up steam with World War I, that you really get the emergence of Black communities as the central focus of this very eugenically oriented still sense of what the crime problem is and how to fight it. And it's really over the next decades that you'll see that the police play a real role in shaping essentially the segregated cities that many of us grew up with, like Chicago, like Detroit, like St. Louis. They often helped to forge segregation itself in cities that didn't have legal segregation. They often helped to push organized crime to operate only in those neighborhoods, bringing the linkage between drugs and other kinds of organized crime and Black communities there. And in repeated occasions when white communities rioted and attempted to lynch or commit arson against Black communities in Detroit, in Tulsa, in Chicago, police forces not only didn't protect them, but often joined the rioters and the looters against them. That's where things stand sort of when we all come into the picture in the post-war period. And I'm going to go very rapidly through this. Many of you know this history because we grew up in these cities and saw it all happen. At the end of World War II, American cities and big industrial cities were essentially at their maximum of population, of economic relevance and strength. It probably couldn't last, and it didn't. And very deliberately, a decision was made to essentially relocate the housing of the middle class from the cities to the suburbs. You all remember that when everybody moved, the great white migration out from the central city, white flight, as it was even explicitly called in that era. And also deindustrialization. My parents grew up in Detroit. By 1950, about half of the automobile factories in Detroit had already been shut down, right? We blame a lot of that in the 1960s and sometimes reverse things and make it seem like it was the riots that caused that. Far from it. But what it meant was that, these largely Black communities that had been segregated at the center of American cities, but which were also very close to the most productive jobs in the American economy, were suddenly miles, or even if they went to the south, states away from where industrial plant was being relocated. If that wasn't enough, most big cities embraced another progressive reform called urban planning, which led to the bulldozing of ever more parts of the large cities, leaving those, and often it was aimed, the freeways were built right through the heart of Black communities in order to displace them, but also disjointing them, breaking down the fabric that had allowed urban neighborhoods, even poor urban neighborhoods, to get along relatively well in the mid 20th century. Into this, sort of crime creating scenario waiting to happen came heroin. The first great wave of that addictive drug began to cross American cities in the 1950s and would pick up steam in the 1960s. Well, a lot of this leads very quickly to what many of us grew up with, which is the idea that American cities are ungovernable, they're full of crime, and it's largely a Black problem. And that what we need is a very aggressive effort by police to essentially stem that, protect the outer neighborhoods, save downtown from that encroachment. And that called for a shift from what had been a war on poverty in the early Kennedy and Johnson administration to, after the Watts uprising riot in 1966, a war on crime, right? And what that led to, ironically, is that at the very moment that lots of people, including in the Johnson and Kennedy administration, recognized that policing was terribly problematic, wasn't effective at controlling crime, and was actually quite racist, instead of reinventing it, we essentially doubled down and invested billions of dollars in expanding and essentially bureaucratizing and professionalizing to some extent those police forces, but giving them an ever stronger mandate to aggressively police those same Black communities that they had helped to shape 50 years earlier. Now I'm kind of at my end here, and I'd like to open things up, but let me just kind of conclude by suggesting that some ideas that we might want to talk about in terms of reforming the police and also defunding or shrinking the police. So let me just kind of reel off some often promoted reforms and suggest why I don't think they go far enough. Diversity, it's often said that if police forces were more like the cities they police, that would change things. There's probably real value in recruiting police from urban neighborhoods, but there are plenty of police forces in this country that are demographically similar to the Black communities they police. Baltimore would be one, and it has not solved the problem. to say the least. Training, as I said, I think a lot more could be done here in training, and a lot of it is stuff that should be undone. Police tend to be trained to view every confrontation with citizens as potentially lethal in ways that don't give much margin, for reassessing. If you compare it to the way the military is actually trained, I think a lot of people who have had both trainings agree that the police training is too aggressive in terms of the readiness to use force. Some irony in the idea that our soldiers are trained to be more careful with civilian life often than our police officers. So I think we could do better training. One of the big solutions in the last 10 years has been procedural justice. That's an idea that basically says if police and other authority figures treated people with more respect, showed them more acknowledgement of their dignity, explained why they were being stopped, were polite, etc., that would eventually change people's mistrust toward a positive feeling toward the police. And there's some evidence to believe it is good, but the problem is that, especially with Black communities where there's long histories of direct experience of the negative side of policing, it's not enough. A lot of emphasis is being put on the role of the Justice Department, especially now that under President Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland, there's a reinvigoration of that program. Again, it's a good thing when the Justice Department comes in. They usually audit police departments. They usually require police to collect much better data about themselves. But all I have to mention is that probably the city in the country that has received the most kind of aggressive working up by the Justice Department and embraced it more than other cities, Minneapolis. So if that was working, I don't think we would be where we are at the moment. Regulation, I think a lot more could be done. Police, compared to other administrative agencies, are very unregulated. That is, they're generally given wide discretion to exercise power when and if they see fit and how they see fit. Ironically, when the state wants to cut trees down on your property, they have to go through a lot more hurdles than when they want to, kick down your door and serve a no-knock warrant in the middle of the night, like they did to Breonna Taylor. So we could do a lot more to make the police look a lot more like other administrative agencies, with regulations, with a notice and comment process, with democratic accountability. Still going to be very hard to change what remains, as long as the mission is anti-Blackness. My fear is that putting regulations that sort of limit it is going to be fairly marginal. Are there exciting efforts to innovate how police solve and address violent crime? The answer is yes. And if you Google Operation Ceasefire, you can read about a program that's been piloted in cities, a number of cities around the country, including Oakland at some points, and that has, at least in some cities, arguably made some difference. Problem is with even things like that is they're very individualized in terms of the charisma and engagement of the people involved in doing that. This program basically involves bringing together many of the young men who are most likely to be involved in shootings and offering them sort of a combination of encouragement and threat, bringing clergy and police together to sort of give them the choice, one way to life, one way to death. Some people think it works. I think the reality is it's very hard to scale up. It's not going to be a general solution, although it might be a model for the kind of innovations we should invest in. What about defunding and shrinking? Here, I think there's some low-hanging fruit that we can agree on pretty quickly. We're already agreeing that the police should be out of the traffic business. And the city of Berkeley is one of the first to at least legislate that it's heading in that direction. Think about the death of Dante Wright, right? His car never should have been stopped. They didn't stop his car because they thought he was a danger to the traffic. I'm pretty confident she stopped the car because she was a training officer and she wanted to give her recruits some experience, harassing a Black person, basically. So they racially profiled, they pulled him over. The fact that they ultimately tased him, to me, is obscene enough. That never should have happened. Police basically should only be able to stop a car if it's a clear danger to traffic, like it's evidence of a DUI or reckless driving, or if the police have probable cause that someone in that car has committed a crime and they want to arrest that person. But no more pretext stops based on things hanging under the rear view mirror or a light out on the rear part of the car. Those kinds of things, we don't need them. I would go further and basically stop the police from doing what we call in the business Terry stops. That's for Terry versus Ohio, a 1968 case that upheld the power of the police to basically stop anyone they want, who they are suspicious might be committing or might have committed a crime. Given what we know about implicit bias, it doesn't take much to realize that that is an invitation to racial profiling and has proven so again and again and again. What's less obvious is it doesn't contribute much to crime control. When it does, it's mostly drugs, sometimes guns. But again, we've shown we're aggressively stop and frisking over the last decade or so. And it's not like we really reduce the flow of guns into American cities. I mean, maybe there are other solutions, but stop and frisk is not it. Many cities are now talking about creating special mental health emergency response units that would either be totally non-police or would be a partnership between police and mental health professionals. And especially the one that's all mental health professionals first, at least, I think has a lot to be recommended to it. Everything we know about the way police approach people is that it tends to worsen the anxiety and fear of somebody going through a mental health crisis. We've got to exercise a much firmer hand over dispatch. The business that called the police on George Floyd should be fined and maybe put out of business. They never should have responded to that. Business people, merchants have complete control over whether to accept $20 bills from people. If they think they got a bad one, they should talk to their regular customer. That is not a police matter. Could it possibly have been a justifiable use of Minneapolis's resources to send 3 police officers to go retrieve George Floyd, who may not even have knowingly passed that $20 bill? So I would basically, unless you were calling to report a serious crime, you would be directed towards some other services rather than the police. Now, at the end of the day, are we still going to have, if we in a kind of defund with an abolition horizon, are we still going to have a police force in 50 years? I mean, the short answer is in 50 years, I don't know. But I think for a long time, we will have something like a police force. And the reason is guns. When someone calls and says, there are gunshots being fired outside my house, you're not going to send social workers. You're not going to send mental health professionals, although it might not be bad to have them in the backup. You need to send someone who's armed and who knows how to deal with, hopefully de-escalate an armed conflict. So that's probably going to be the police, or if it's not, then it's just a reinvention of them that we're going to call something else, like a police service, to emphasize their guardian role rather than the warrior role. All of that could be good, but I think we're going to still have that. But I guess what I'd end with is, even if it's inevitable that we're going to need a sort of armed, trained unit or force that is capable of intelligent and deliberate use of violence in the interest of the community and society, it shouldn't be nearly as big as it is now. It shouldn't be the path through which everybody who's going to do all those other things gets trained. As the abolitionist Miasma put it in an interview, when you look at a police officer, you're looking at 1,000 jobs squeezed into a person with a gun. And that doesn't sound like a very promising. Lastly, as I mentioned, these institutions date centuries back. They were based on scientific or other ideas that are now way out of date. My question is, couldn't we do better if we want to really reduce violence, if we want to protect Black lives, even if we have that residual police force to address armed violence? Couldn't we do better in trying to solve and even prevent violent crime through more deft use of technology and other kinds of interventions that we're capable of in the early 21st century? Seems very odd that we're kind of stuck with cages and armed police, the great technologies of the 19th century here in the 21st. So with that, I think I've probably offended enough people or raised enough blood pressure out there to get some questions and some response, and I'd be very happy to engage in dialogue now.
That was fascinating. I'll go to the chat box, but I'm still trying to digest what you said. So there's a range of questions. I did want to share with you what you asked a question at the beginning, a time when you felt safe. And somebody did respond to that. And they said that in the 50s, when they were a child, as a white girl, they did feel safe. And then you asked about were they ever humiliated? And they said by teachers who told him that that she as a girl couldn't go into science and math. So that was an interesting response.
I appreciate that. And the reason I asked about humiliation is that, we put a lot of focus on deadly force. But, for every, say, Black person who gets killed by the police, there's 10,000 that have been humiliated at some point by being thrown up against a car and frisked.
Right.
And that lasts, it lasts a lifetime.
Right. Okay, so there was a specific question about a bill in the legislature, but I want to read this one first because I think it's going to open up a whole new path here. Could you talk a bit more about the historic role of police in suppressing social movements? This is a major theme of Mike Davis and John Weiner's book, Set the Night on Fire. You mentioned the police murder of Fred Hampton. Since we're in the Bay Area, can we also talk about the San Francisco Police Officers Association role in the death of Harvey Milk?
The latter part, I know that Dan White had been a police officer. I'll open up for more discussion on that, but I definitely want to highlight this police role in social movements and identify something really interesting and I think sinister, which is that the beginning of that is the eugenic era, right? Who are the first social movement types that the police are essentially spying on? It's, Jewish and Italian organizers that are rabble rousing, right? And they're seen as immigrants and from inferior criminal races, right? And so police who had been invented to do this kind of general disciplining of the working class begin to focus on, what they see as the really dangerous elements based on ethnicity and based on their radical politics, right? People like Emma Goldman, who's a Jewish Russian anarchist organizer who's very well known to the New York police in this period. So this is a period where big city police departments develop red squads, and they're very much seen as eugenic tools, right? The people doing this rabble rousing are not just, people with bad ideology. They're people with bad genes, basically, who need to be maybe deported, as Emma Goldman was. And then that continues, right? So that those red squads are still being litigated in the 1960s. So a lot of them don't end until the wave of protests in the 60s leads lawyers to begin to sue over them. But by then, you also have another dimension of policing social movements, which I'm not an expert in, but is obviously incredibly important today, and that is policing demonstrations. And what's interesting there is that many of you will remember the big demonstrations of the 60s. Many of you will remember the revulsion at police riots like this one in Chicago. Notice that they were beating up white people, which is one of the reasons that was a national conversation, reporters and delegates to the Democratic National Convention. But it actually led to about a 20-year period where policing of protest was being sort of managed more liberally, where there was more effort to reduce the sort of visibility and aggressiveness of policing. That began to reverse itself with the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999. And really ever since then, we've seen more and more aggressive, more and more militarized policing, not just in the US, and England is doing it too, efforts to so-called kettle demonstrators, trap them in sort of dead-end streets or on the Brooklyn Bridge in ways that are dangerous as hell and obviously very, very disruptive. So I really think it's another reason to talk about sort of shrinking and defunding the police. I think we ought to create a whole different kind of crowd control, one that's not based on the police. One, because God knows we're going to have demonstrations, and we should, and we do need a public way to sort of make those demonstrations safe. But it doesn't need to be the police, and it certainly doesn't need to be this heavily militarized version that we've seen recently.
Okay, well, that brings us to another question. If it doesn't need to be that, what do you think about, and I think there was an article in today's Chronicle actually today about communities hiring private security to guard their neighborhoods from break-ins or car vandalism, and having, I think, for example, in the Asian community, they have people escorting people and watching out for older people. What about that approach?
Look, it's a really important question. The first thing to recognize is that private security and private policing already plays a huge role. And if you're fortunate enough to live in, a wealthy suburb or in a large apartment building that has a lot of private services, you will be, or universities for that matter, which have their own in-house police departments, you will have essentially private policing, private security, I think actually play a productive role. We have a lot of crime on the Berkeley campus, some of which might be benefited from literally just having more security people there, not necessarily police with guns, but people with flashlights and walkie-talkies, walking students from BART back up to the dorms and things of that nature. That may play a role. Indeed, we probably should take some of the money that we're defunding from the police, give it to some of the highest crime neighborhoods in America to organize groups in those communities to either self-organize security, the way the Black Panther Party did in the 1960s and 70s, or to hire security. Indeed, in some of the townships in South Africa, that's exactly what they chose to do. They were so mistrustful of the South African police that they wanted instead to hire private security. But again, we don't want to make the mistake of assuming that just because it's private, it's going to not run into these same problems. If the mission is anti-Black, and it is, I think, for a lot of private police out in the suburbs that are there to keep people who don't look like they belong there from there, then we're just making the problem worse in some ways. And I still believe that we need police in the big sense I mentioned, the commitment to keeping the community safe, healthy, et cetera, be public, that there be a public responsibility for that. That can't become just a question of who has the money, although too often it is.
Well, okay, so if you're saying we still need to have the police, this next question will be an interesting one. The person said, as a labor unionist, would you share your thoughts about the role of police unions and their, quote, thug presidents?
It's a great question. We have a terrific scholar actually at Berkeley Law, Catherine Fisk, who's been giving some talks on that. She writes on union histories, and she's given some talks on police unions that is much more learned than I. But you're exactly right. I mean, I don't use the term thug because it's a colonialist, racist term that came from the British control of India. The thugs were a certain ethnic group within India, so let's always kind of decolonize our language as much as we can. But the fact that so many of these police union heads come from multi-generational police families. A lot of them are Irish, representing the long-term role, and many of them have taken explicitly anti-Black political stands. I mean, the very fact that so many police unions endorsed President Trump was outrageous, right? You would never see units of the U.S. military endorsing a candidate, and you wouldn't want to see that. Can police unions play a role? Possibly, but they have to be very different kinds of unions. One of the things that happened, unions weren't allowed in policing or prisons until I think the 70s, more or less. And they're still very, very restricted in terms of their power of striking. But what was interesting is that when they then unionized, it wasn't with traditional unions. They very deliberately made a decision to sort of organize along the lines of being crime fighters rather than workers. And this is very true in the prisons as well. You could have organized the prison correctional officers with the same unions that organized nurses and teachers, but instead they deliberately decided to replicate the police model because they saw that it was politically really advantageous to define themselves not just another worker with their hand out asking for more money, but as the victim's advocate, protecting victims. So that kind of union has to go. Frankly, I think the federal courts here in Oakland should just, end the union. I think, the Constitution is more important than unions. You have a decade where you can't get the police to conform to the Constitution, partly because of the intransigence of the union. I would have no trouble breaking it and then reforming it with a true union and not one based on an inherently anti-Black ideology.
Okay, so I'm going to get back to that bill in the legislature because I think it ties into one of the questions here. But this will kind of refocus in a different way, maybe. So this person asks, is our focus in the wrong place? Should we be focusing more on gun control and income inequity to solve some of the issues that the police are now dealing with? So instead of finding, private security or better training or whatever, should we put our focus somewhere else? And I think this goes with it, but okay, no question that your focus on the origins of racist and excessive policing is valuable, nor that your partial solutions have merit in nibbling away at the racist policing. But how do you bring the population and national politicians along with you without endless videos of horrific abuses?
Thank you. Thank you for both of those. So let me address the first part of it and then get to sort of the politics of how this could work in terms of building a support. I'm going to bracket gun control. This gets me in big trouble with my spouse and others. I'm a bit of a pessimist in terms of how effective or how quickly even very effective gun control could significantly make a dent. We have over 500 million guns in private hands. It will take an enormous effort to remove those. Would that effort look like policing in prisons? Would it be focused on Black communities again? So I have a lot of concerns about what that looks like, but I totally embrace not only income inequality, but the issue that I think is now at the forefront in the Bay Area, which is housing and dignity, access to a dignified place to live as a basic human right. I just don't think we can think about having really a civilized, decent kind of society where we have large portions of our community essentially living outside of the basic structures of dignified life, housing, toilet access, clothes, things of this nature. And again, it is unfair to police or to any other agency to sort of have them constantly have to roll in and address these crises when they're exploding in front of us. I mean, I live in North Berkeley, and we turn away from citizens every day who are suffering from ill health, ill housing, hand out a few dollars to them perhaps, but how many of us are actually building tiny houses or whatever it will take to make a difference? We're going to have to do that. And the long-term solution to a lot of crime, we've known in criminology forever. You need essentially strong educational and jobs programs so that nobody between the ages of 16 and 26 is allowed to just fall into a life of crime or criminalization where you keep picking them up and putting them back on the jobs ladder no matter what. You did that, it would begin to look like what the eugenicists promised in terms of a sweeping reduction in crime in a generation. In terms of how to make this palatable, I think the important thing to understand here is the difference between national politics and local politics. And here the good news is that police are local. We have two different kinds of politics in America, in a sense. We have national and even statewide politics, because in a state like California, it's as big as a nation state. Problem with national politics is the nation is, as the historian Benedict Anderson put it, an imaginary community. Nobody actually knows that they live in a country. They have to imagine it, right? But everybody lives in a place and they encounter the realities of their localness, their placeness. And I think that we're already seeing a shift in our big cities. The election of DAs like George Gascon in Los Angeles, like Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. There's a marked shift in the demand of many urban Americans for a different kind of policing, a different kind of public safety. So I think we're going to have a much more productive kind of conversation at the local level. Periodically, it'll be pulled up to the national level, mostly by people who want to stop it, where it'll be easier to scare people into thinking that the police are going to be, immediately destroyed, the way Trump tried to do during the campaign with some success. But again, and Biden has suggested he won't take a big stand on this, and it's probably smart for him not to. What he could do is provide the funds, just like Bill Clinton did in the 90s, to hire more police. President Biden could provide the funds for local communities to replace the police with other kinds of agencies so that that money wouldn't have to come just from one place or another, but could come in. So I think there's a possible productive cycle there. And remember, there's 18,000 separate police agencies in America. So that means it's a long-term problem, but also means that we can make progress very rapidly in those communities that have the political will to do so.
Okay, so somebody continuing with that idea, somebody asked for some practical suggestions for beginning to defund the police. And then what we got is I think you basically have an advisory committee here. We've got about 7 or 8 different suggestions for how to shrink the police or change the whole thing. So someone said, couldn't we defund or abolish and have a legal restriction on military vehicles in police forces? And then here's a really interesting one. I've heard police officers say in interviews that because they carry a lethal weapon, they must approach any encounter with a consciousness that if the other person gets control of the weapon, the officer's life may be at risk. This presumption seems to underlie the shocking encounters we've witnessed in which responding police escalate rather than resolve solutions. How much difference would it make to restrict weapons carrying to a small subset of the police? Then somebody else suggested that we ban military vehicles from being used by the police. And there are a few other suggestions of that sort. So what about the practical suggestions? And maybe this does get to the bill in the California legislature, Senate Bill 2, which is about decertification of the police.
I'm not really familiar. I'm not familiar with that particular measure. Fortunately, there have been so many recent ones. And by the way, there's another article in the Times right now on their website about, I think 180 laws have been passed around the country since George Floyd's death, aiming in some way or another to reform, defund, or change policing. So really interesting moment to go out and see what some of these are doing. Let's talk a little bit about some of these things. The military vehicles, they're clearly repellent. They clearly escalate situations. They're relatively trivial in the larger scheme of things. That is, they tend to get handed out by the federal government when we have a lot of war surplus, as we have from Afghanistan and Iraq. 40 years ago, it was Vietnam. They were sending armored personnel carriers to police forces then in the late 60s. So they've always been around. They've always been a problem. I don't place them. I think we could easily get rid of them, but that it would still leave the fact that police are driving more civilian cars, using weapons designed to look less frightening would all be a good thing. I don't think without other changes, I wouldn't change, again, this essentially anti-Black nature of this policing. I'm intrigued by the armed police point. That's certainly correct, that it becomes its own vector of risk to the officer. It's certainly the case that the vast majority of police officers will retire without having once drawn their service weapon, is a frequently mentioned statistic. There are surely lots of police jobs where having a gun immediately handy isn't essential, and where it's not always enough, right? And here in Oakland, where we had, I think, 4 police officers killed by a person about 10 years ago in a horrifying day. I think it was the greatest day of killing in the Oakland police history. Reminds us that having a gun, when you're not ready to use it, and that's why then they bring it out so often. So whether you could literally restrict it to a small unit, you could certainly create larger parts of the police role where they're not armed, but then wouldn't those be low-hanging fruit to move out of policing altogether? So at some point you might get down to, yes, they have guns, but they're a lot smaller than they were. Some of these police forces are huge, and they cost, some cities spend between a quarter and half their entire budget on policing, right? And so it's an enormous cost that could be spent taking care of that bigger police family. Decertification, as I understand it, would go to one of the sort of regulatory structures that would put in place, in a sense, a stronger system of incentives for police forces and individual officers to take these things seriously. And to the extent that we haven't done that, shame on us. I mean, let me say this again to show that I don't think this is the shoe fits on a lot of feet. I mean, up till really 5 years ago, I would say universities were completely ignoring sexual harassment by their faculties to an outrageous degree. And it's only been huge embarrassment in the media and multiple million-dollar lawsuits that have kind of gotten their attention. And so, yeah, there has to be accountability, but I don't think it will change some of the basic problems that I've underlined.
Well, that's interesting because so two different people suggested the accountability issue. One has to do with when police departments settle civil suits. Does the cost of those settlements come from the police budget, general fund, or insurance? Can these arrangements be improved to make police more accountable for misbehavior? And then somebody else wants to know whether you think police review boards to reform police, what do you think about them to make them more accountable? And here is, by the way, what SB2 is. It offers a path to remove officers. This is more about accountability, who harm our communities from the streets. It will establish a statewide process to automatically decertify officers who are fired for certain specified misconduct, such as excessive force, sexual misconduct, and dishonesty. You know, and it does seem to me that what's happening here is that some people are wanting to drill down, you know, to specific things without actually reimagining maybe the police as the basic core. And then there are other people here who, and I'll read one of these later, who want to sort of look at the root causes and get changing the system and get away from, you know, looking at the cops.
So, you know, great questions. I mean, I find accountability a complicated issue, partly because I think our over obsession with accountability in American law tends to help make us very punitive. It's one of the reasons we kind of insist on people essentially paying their debt to society, often with long years in prison. Often the very framework, and again, I'm encouraged by the prosecution of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. I think it was very well done. I got to analyze a lot of the trial, at least through the print media. I can't watch it because of my teaching schedule a lot of the time, but I thought they did a very good job presenting a case that might in fact result in conviction. Here's the problem though. To the extent that the Minneapolis police succeed in convincing that jury that Derek Chauvin was way outside the bounds of policing and that every police officer in their right mind is appalled and angry at what he did, and I think that's to some extent true, it helps to reinforce the idea that it's really a problem of rogue officers and not a problem of the basic mission. And we have both, right? There's no doubt that either through being attracted to the job or through burnout, people become indifferent to humanity sometimes as police and commit acts that are like murder and that obviously need to be held accountable. But at the same time, way too much of ordinary policing and the way we train police to do their job is the problem, is anti-Black, is humiliating, even if it's not lethal in its effects, and has to be addressed not with accountability so much as really norms and a whole different model of what you're doing. In terms of accountability mechanisms, commentators are quite right that our current lawsuit system doesn't do much to deter the police. It certainly doesn't come out of the individual's officer's pocket. It rarely comes out of the police department's pocket. If you want to get outraged, consider that in their last annual budget, the city of Chicago budgeted over $130 million for future police violations of civil rights, right? They know it's coming, right? And that's appalling. An interesting idea that many people wouldn't maybe occur to many people is having the private insurance industry play a bigger role. So many of you know that other professionals like lawyers and doctors, actuaries, stock investment people, et cetera, often have to carry private insurance that against their own malpractice. And that if they then have a lot of misconduct, the rate for their insurance that they have to pay goes way, way up. And so one model would be to have police officers have that kind of insurance, have the city pay the basic starter level, but once you have misconduct that makes your rate go up, you pay that out of pocket if you want to stay in policing. And also insurers then might play some role in developing better training and developing methods of accountability that are preventive rather than just punitive. The last point on the police review boards and fair disclosure, I'm the current chair of the UC Berkeley Police Review Board. These have been around for about 30 years now. Some of them are being improved now. And I have to say, I haven't taken a close look at the new Berkeley, City of Berkeley configuration, but let me just say that the history has not been a great one. By and large, they're kept pretty far from the action, which is actually investigating complaints. They may get involved with appeals when people are rejected by the police on their initial complaint. they're generally pretty toothless. And I don't see them as a great solution unless they can get more directly involved in investigating and making decisions about policing policy.
Okay, so how about a couple more questions? Would that be okay? All right, so I just want to capture two suggestions, and one was to have the police keep their guns in the trunks of their cars. I hear my retired police officer husband groaning in the background here. And then somebody also wanted you to say something about tasers, but I want to go back to the thing you said in the beginning about your values and how they impact on this, because we have two comments and questions here that will bring you back, I think, to that, and maybe that's a good place to close. So one person said, I hear, understand, and tend to agree with most of John Simon's premises and suggestions. However, in my personal experience, I've met many white people who resonate with the idea of defunding the police, but no people of color. Okay, and then the other comment, which again goes back to the bigger picture here. So this person says, since race is a social construct, it is worth considering why and when race was created. And you did, okay, it was created to benefit something. What? If race is thus used for a purpose, then understanding the purpose helps to get to the root cause for the existence of race. Without looking at root causes and then working to change the dynamics of the systems that perpetrate race, most reforms are only band-aids. So non-reformist reforms are needed to change the underlying system. Could this be the case? So I know that's given you two very broad questions to close with, but have at it.
Right. And I was starting to write down whether Black people and communities are going to support. Remind me again of the second one, because I was directly on point.
Okay, so the first one, basically wanted to know why,
right. That one I got.
Color. Okay, so this one was more about getting to the root cause.
Right.
Since race is a social construct.
So, I mean, I think that's where I think it's important to recognize that we don't have one racism. We have multiple arcs of racism, right? There's an arc that goes from back to 400 years ago when they began to legally distinguish from indentured servants on the one hand and these kidnapped Africans on the other who would never leave the status of enslavement. So we've got a kind of arc of slavery that was all about creating a workforce, and producing wealth for American society at that time. I think we have a second arc of racism that comes from the eugenics movement and the idea that some races have greater concentrations of positive traits and other races have greater concentrations of negative traits. Unfortunately, when this kind of became widely unpopular after the Nazis sort of took it too far, you might say, or eugenicists might have said, oh, those Nazis, they kind of gave it all a bad reputation because they thought eugenics was great. And there's another great book I can recommend, James Q. Whitman's Hitler's American Model, which shows that the Nazis, when they got to power, thought that America was the world leader in racial governance and eugenics and were desperate to catch up with us. And they indeed copied our segregation and miscegenation laws, applying them to Jews and others in the Reich that they didn't like. But the point is, when at the end of World War II, eugenics got a really bad name because of that. But the problem is that especially its kind of criminological focus on Black bodies and Black communities never went away. Instead, it was quickly turned into sociology. Well, it's not bad genes, it's bad neighborhoods, it's bad family structures, it's bad childhoods that create persistent offenders, right? So you're no longer talking about the born criminal, but you're still talking about a target of crime being essentially a Black object, which you just know isn't right. We have concentrations of especially violent crime in Black communities, largely because of this history of segregation, of impoverishment. On this point about today's Black communities, for instance, in Oakland, which created a task force to look into defunding the police, and indeed several of the Black members of that task force then said they wanted to kind of hit the pause button because in their own community, there was a lot of concern about what defunding the police would mean at a time when, violent crime is surging. So I guess there are two things or three things I'd say about that. One is, if you ask more than just simply the question, do you support defunding the police or do you want more police? What you find is that most people of color, most Black people want safety, they want security, they want more of a different kind of policing, that they don't like the policing they're getting by and large, but they also don't want to defund the police because they hear that as saying, well, we'll just ignore you altogether then. There's a history in this country, and James Foreman Jr. wrote a great book about this called Locking Up Our Own, which studies the war on crime as it unfolded in Washington, D.C. after it became a Black majority city in 1973, or a Black electorate because they had home rule. And what he shows is that essentially Black communities began to embrace policing and punishment as a solution to high levels of violence only after they saw that, the war on poverty wasn't coming back, that there weren't going to be real efforts to address these gaping problems. So yeah, police are better than nothing for many people in Black communities. But again, the real problem is, and I think police officers themselves and police leaders are honest about this and need to be careful about this, there's not much they can do about this current surge of violent crime that we're seeing. Again, we don't 100% know why it's happening. It may be because with fewer people on the streets, when members of rival youth sets run into each other, it's harder to kind of disappear, but we don't know exactly. It may be that the burden that the pandemic is putting on other parts of their support network, women in their lives in particular, has negatively impacted them. We don't know, but the truth is there's not much people with badges and guns can do to get in between those young people, at least in the short term. So let's not let this current pandemic-driven violence make us delay this important task of reinventing.
Okay, that was about as thorough an answer as you could have squeezed in the amount of time we had. So Irene Marcos has an important message for us as a last minute here. And I do want to say something. There are some really interesting comments in the chat.
I'm going to save it.
Yeah, do, because some of them are very interesting. They weren't questions so much as comments. And there is also, and Irene will tell you this too, there's also a comment in there that tells you how to donate if you want Ashby Village to keep doing these wonderful presentations. So take a look at the chat, everybody. And Irene, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Jonathan, for such an interesting afternoon of conversation. I want to tell you about two upcoming presentations that we have. Elder Action is going to be on May 16th, having the founder of Cal Center for Right-Wing Studies, Lawrence Rosenthal, will be presenting. He's going to be introduced by Ashby Village member Troy Duster. And then on July 18th, we have, this will be an arts and culture presentation. We have Ashby Village member Russ Ellis talking to two African-American photographers who have exhibited their works internationally. And they are both photographers and scholars, Louis Watts and Ray Holbert. So again, thank you so much. And there is an opportunity to make a donation of any amount to Ashby Village so that we can continue offering these wonderful presentations. And you can do it through the chat box. You can do it through ashbyvillage.org. And by the way, for anyone who unfortunately had to miss today's presentation, it usually is on our Ashby Village YouTube channel for you to see this presentation and others that we've had in the past. So thanks again. It's been a great afternoon, and enjoy the rest of the day. And we'll see you for either Lawrence Rosenthal's presentation on May 16th or our presentation with Russ Ellis and the two photographers on July 18th. Thanks so much and have a great afternoon and stay safe. Bye now.